after the success of the Atari VCS, Mattel as a toy company looked at this and said, maybe we should consider getting into this business.
They started their Mattel Electronics division, releasing handheld games. Their handheld football, which was an LED game, was a smash hit.
Somebody had the idea that the TI, Texas Instruments calculator chip, could also be used for games. It worked in calculators, we could make a game out of it. That's where those handheld games came from.
When I first saw it, I'm like, how is this football? Because the field is only this big. How is this 100 yards? And then, of course, you play it and you realize you have to go multiple times to get a touchdown. But oh man, it was great.
The Atari VCS was being sold in toy stores. Mattel did not like giving up shelf space and consumer dollars in toy stores. And I think as much as anything, it's that sense of holding your position, holding market share in the toy industry. That plus the sense that there was a potential here, I think, is what drove the decision.
Mattel saw that Atari was making lots of money, hand over fist, making video games, and decided to make their own console, which they called the Intellivision.
They had an outside consulting group make a set of initial games for the machine for the playtest.
They contracted with a company run by a man named Glenn Hightower to develop the system and develop cartridges for it. So he ran this company, APH Technology Consultants. Mattel found him and contracted him and his company to produce the system and the games. And in 1979, the end of 1979, they test marketed the Intellivision, and then it went full release in 1980.
They test marketed the Intellivision video game console in Fresno, California, and it tested out great. And this was late 1980, and that was when the radio ad got put on the radio. I was actually driving home from work one day, and I heard an ad on the radio, and the ad said, "Do you want to work in the exciting world of video games?" And I didn't know whether to look down at the radio or look up to God that I was being talked to it this way. And would you like to help shape the future of this exciting new entertainment medium? At first, they did not believe that I had been programming video games for 9 years. Eventually, they realized I was telling the truth, and I got hired as one of the original 5 in-house programmers at Mattel. So the original 5 team members at Intellivision on day one were Gabriel Baum, who was our manager, Mike Minkoff, John Soule, myself, Rick Levine. The consultants at APH who had been working on the test market games also continued to stay involved, and they also were working on games in parallel to us. But like modern video game companies, Mattel realized they wanted to control the development themselves, and that's why they built an in-house team. If you were a toy designer, or you worked for the toy company, you turned left and you went into what was then a modern office tower. If you turned right, you went down into where we were, except that was a converted warehouse.
The entire video game division, we were in a separate building. And at lunchtime, we were allowed to walk down this middle corridor to the lunchroom, and everybody's doors in the toy company, all the doors were closed. And it was like, you're not allowed to go into any of those doors. It was very like, secret, secret, secret. And then we would go and we'd have lunch, and then we'd go back. And one day we were walking down that corridor, and some like little motorized car was zooming around. It was like, oh, there's life, there's a toy, but it went through a door and it closed. And so we were outsiders.
ATARI developed this joystick, which is just a stick coming up, and you can move it with the ATARI in 8 different directions: forward, backward, left, right, and then the 4 diagonals. And that controlled the object on the screen. Mattel decided to go better than that. Mattel controller is a rectangle with this disc on the bottom, a round disc, but 12 buttons over it. Anyway, what the disc was, you can press it in any of 16 directions, and that controlled what goes on the screen. If you're used to a joystick, it's difficult to work with.
I didn't like the controller. I didn't like the controller. I didn't like it.
I mean, a joystick with a button, that feels like a video game. This other one felt like an accounting package.
The Intellivision had the bad interface versus the joystick. Things like that were just things you would argue over all the time.
It felt maybe even like the games were very soft. They weren't edgy.
I'd say visually the Intellivision looked a lot better, but also the 2600, because of its requirement for drawing the screen, meant that every game had to run at 60 frames per second.
Like even today we had discussions like, can we get to 60 frames a second? And like every Atari game that exists is 60 frames a second, because if they didn't, they have to hit that or the screen won't draw, you know? So no Atari game has any sort of lag or anything, because they had no option to have lag.
How many 2600 games were made? 600 in the original few years of the console? That was possible because the software controlled everything, and in the Intellivision, the hardware did what it could do and nothing else.
Out of all the systems I've worked on, the one actually that kind of bested me was the Intellivision, because it's such a unique architecture.
The instruction set for the Intellivision was not an 8-bit instruction set. General Instruments made it 10 bits wide. So when we wrote instructions, we had more opportunities, more things we could do in assembly language because it was 10 bits wide. Basically, it just means we had a book with more pages, listing the dictionary of what we could do.
You hear stories about how some engineers just couldn't quite get the Intellivision to do what they wanted. And the reason some of the games are slower is because that understanding of that architecture is very challenging. So games could run really fast on the Intellivision. You just had to do it a certain way. And most people tried to approach programming the Intellivision like they would the Atari 2600 or an old 8-bit computer. They thought that's the way you should do it. But in fact, the Intellivision has a very specific way you should be creating games for it.
So it was made with newer technology. And with that technology, they were capable of making more resolution of backgrounds, more colors, not necessarily better colors, but more sprites. I think they could put 8 sprites on the screen.
The Intellivision itself, because they started work on it about 2 years after Atari had started work on the VCS, it had more advanced chips. And so where the Atari was using a 6502 chip, which is a very basic and because of its simplicity, a powerful chip for its time. We were using a GI 1610 chip, which had 16-bit logic in it as opposed to 8-bit. Everybody says, oh, 8-bit, 16-bit. Well, Intellivision was kind of 3 different kinds of bits. We were very confusing.
The thing is, once we programmers started doing tricks and making the Atari 2600 do things that it was not supposed to do, we ended up with more sprites than the Intellivision. I did a game called Freeway, and Freeway had 10 moving sprites on the screen.
In many cases, a lot of engineers that were on the Atari went to Intellivision and vice versa. And then many engineers that went out to third parties like Activision and whatnot would end up working on multiple platforms. So they'd work on Intellivision and Atari.
I mean, I was at a CES one day showing Pitfall, and the Intellivision programming crew came around. I remember just kind of standing behind them, and they were saying, how do you make a swinging vine that would use all 8 of our sprites? There would be nothing left for Pitfall Harry. And so the swinging vine is a trick. It's a programming trick. And without it, Pitfall doesn't exist.
All the companies in the Bay Area particularly that were working on Atari and Intellivision games were told not to intermingle, not to hang out with people from the other companies because of company secrets being let loose, and nobody wants anybody to know what everybody else is working on.
But occasionally, the programmers would run into each other in the mall, and one of them would say, I finally figured out how you did that thing, you know, or whatever. So there was a little bit of interconnection.
But then hearing that they would all get together for beers at people's houses and play the games they're working on with everybody. And so it was like completely opposite of what they were asked to do. But it was a way for them all to keep sane and also to help each other out. Because once everybody was able to share what they had, even though they weren't supposed to, it really helped everybody understand like how they could improve their games and all stuff with all these great designers in the area.
I'll try almost anything. So when Mattel Electronics asked me to compare their Intellivision games with Atari, I gave it a try.
Mattel started making these commercials with George Plimpton, comparing the two systems.
He was a writer who was brought in as the spokesperson for Intellivision. He would prop up a 2600 game against an Intellivision game and just ask you, basically ask you to tell the difference.
And I think the commercials played that up. You know, as you said, the commercials, you know, implied you were high and mighty if you could afford a Intellivision and you weren't stuck down in the, you know, dregs with your Atari machine.
As a generation of kids and adults were told every night on television by our Intellivision ads, it was a clearly superior video game console.
And so you'd see this like really amazing baseball game on the Intellivision that like in our eyes back then looked like real baseball, and then you see like some blocks over on the 2600 and weird sounds coming out, and baseball talks on the Intellivision, 2600 makes beeps and that sort of thing. So they would beg you to like compare it yourself and make the decision.
I compared Atari baseball with Intellivision and found Intellivision played much more like real baseball.
Where the Intellivision, which cost $100 more than the VCS, where it excelled was in the sports games and great graphics.
Our rival television commercials for Intellivision Atari ran each night, and inside the company we were tracking sales to see how we were doing, and it was very much competition. And of course we wanted to beat them.
Then they showed the two football games, and the Atari football I've always hated. It doesn't resemble football at all, where the Intellivision version resembles football.
Then I compared Atari football with Intellivision. Again, Intellivision played more like the real game.
The famous Atari game football was like 3-on-3 or 4-on-4, and that was a travesty to football fans. So the Intellivision felt, hey, we can at least, here's a baseball game, you got all the people on the field. Here's a football game, you have a bigger team.
Our emphasis on sports at Intellivision was just recognizing that those were the games that we were doing that people were most responding to. Most of our best sellers were our sports games. And that was the place where we were clearly beating Atari in the marketplace in terms of people's perceptions.
In my opinion, if you try them both, there's only one conclusion you can come to. Intellivision from Mattel Electronics.
The problem was they didn't have any arcade games, and Atari, being an arcade company, excelled in arcade games. And another problem with the Intellivision was it was a slower system than the VCS because it sacrificed memory for graphics rather than for speed. And so Atari retaliated with their own commercial showing this nerdy looking kid and saying, well, here's Atari's arcade games and here's Mattel's arcade games, and there are no Mattel arcade games.
As an intelligent consumer, I wanted to compare Atari Asteroids with other companies' Asteroids. But other companies don't make Asteroids.
Atari had coin-op games that had great brands that people already knew, and that they could bring those into their home operation. We didn't have that at Mattel. And so we ended up licensing with Data East. But even then we were doing more games that were derivative or copy type, just to try and keep pace with Atari.
I wanted to compare Atari Missile Command with other companies' missile commands, but other companies don't make that either.
Well, it probably didn't help that Intellivision came from a toy company. There's an aura there of softness, and Atari was, video gaming.
But ultimately, when you played the games, you could really tell the difference then, because the Intellivision and the way it presented graphics, the frame rate was pretty slow. It was pretty plotting, and the 2600 had this really fast frame rate. So games that were like shooters, racing games, all that stuff on the 2600 felt great, but they looked really nice on the Intellivision.
When it comes to the video games the world wants most, nobody compares to Atari.
So in a normal world, the Intellivision would have come along and blown the Atari out of the water because it seemed to have 4 times as much capability. That wasn't the reality. That was only the anticipation.
Despite all the TV commercials that Mattel ran every night for years saying how we were better, we never caught Atari in video game sales because of that price difference.
I'll try almost anything. So when Mattel Electronics asked me to compare their Intellivision games with Atari, I gave it a try. I compared Atari baseball with Intellivision and found Intellivision played much more like real baseball. Then I compared Atari football with Intellivision. Again, Intellivision played more like the real game. In my opinion, if you try them both, there's only one conclusion you can come to. Intellivision from Mattel Electronics.
As an intelligent consumer, I wanted to compare Atari asteroids with other companies' asteroids. But other companies don't make asteroids. I wanted to compare Atari Missile Command with other companies' missile commands. But other companies don't make that either. Finally, I wanted to compare the new Atari Warlords. Unfortunately, other companies don't make it. When it comes to the video games the world wants most, nobody compares to Atari.
Mattel Electronics had no interest in making cartridges for the Atari 2600. What happened was this Glenn Hightower, who made the original cartridges for the Intellivision, he realized he got a bad deal out of it. Whatever games they sold to Mattel, they would get $30,000. Meanwhile, Mattel would turn around and sell like 50,000 copies of the games for a huge amount of money. And so he decided, well, why I should get in on this side. So he had his people reverse engineer the Atari 2600. They started making Atari versions of the Intellivision games.
So I remember when we were in the meeting where we were being told we were going to do this as a company, and we weren't asked, we were told.
It is hard to join a business that there's already 600 products.
Right.
And you're going to try to duplicate
And make a
one of
mark.
them. Yeah.
Yeah. Pretty hard.
Most of the executives there didn't want to do it. They said, why should we sell games for a competing system? Also, they're worried that people will look down on them, like, they're jumping on the bandwagon for another company. And then Hightower convinced them there's 10 million Atari VCSs out there. There's 2 million Intellivisions out there. So instead of selling games just for 2 million consoles, you could sell games for potentially 12 million consoles. And Mattel liked that idea, and that's why they went with it.
Once video games really started to take off and become this big boom, we had all of these copycat companies trying to come in from the outside, apart from Atari, Mattel, Activision. And everybody was trying to start a video game company. So you had Games by Apollo, which some investors started up. You had the Quaker Oats video game division. And I say that and people think, oh, Don's joking. No, there really was a Quaker Oats video game division. When you have all that kind of stuff going on and people trying to build games for Intellivision and for Atari, at a certain point, I think both companies decided, I don't know who went first or who influenced, well, we should probably be making games for each other because it's now at the point. We make games.
Mattel wants to make Atari games. Everybody has an Atari. We want to sell games. That was what they told us. Atari's everywhere, so let's make games that people will buy because of that.
As the teams evolved and kind of subdivided, one of the factors was those who had experience on 6502, which was quite a few of our programmers at that point. They tended to migrate more towards the VCS, and those who did not certainly were staying on Intellivision.
And I was hired just to do the VCS, nothing else, because I had learned machine language, in college. And the VCS runs on machine language.
Some folks just loved the Intellivision and didn't want to go anywhere. For other people, it was kind of like, oh, we get to go head to head with Atari? That would be fun.
There was that added art part too, of let's be a step above. There was definitely that concept of we're going to be above Astro Smash or whatever those other things are. We're going to be special, high society Atari.
We as a whole, as a group, both M Network and Intellivision, felt like we had really good artists. So when I think about that, what Jane is saying rings true. We were good at combining artists and programmers in a way that brought the best out in both the programmers and the artists.
I was the only woman programmer in the whole group of M Network. I was kind of unaware of how unusual it was. So we were just like a bunch of people and we all cared about video games, and the problems of the VCS and conquering it, and we would share, oh crap, my cycles went too long. I mean, it was a team thing.
Somebody told me, you know that company M Network at CES? That's Mattel. And I said, I don't think so. It doesn't make any sense. And then I found out it was. And I said, oh, okay, so they're giving up.
I just clicked this magazine. It was Electronic Games. But they had this rumor page, and they talked about how Mattel was going to start making games for the Atari 2600. I couldn't get to my friend's house fast enough to be like, victory. Like, there's no way Atari would make games for the Mattel Intellivision, which they would later.
Atari did the same thing. They made games for the Intellivision under the Atari Soft label and other systems too. So there was definitely a lot of back and forth with all these companies once they started cross-selling games across platforms.
But at the time, they were the first to concede, and so I was very excited, not because I wanted the games, which I kind of did, but because I could actually claim victory over my friends that Mattel has to make Atari games to succeed in the game business.
It was just another revenue stream. It was another revenue stream. And it was a good thing for gamers because you could play the games on whichever system you chose.
A lot of their library is based on Intellivision games, and the Intellivision was a pretty capable console. Visually it looked different from the 2600, but a lot of the games had a lot of depth to them.
The cartridge shape was basically the Intellivision cartridge, but then they had this 2600 weird adapter they plugged into it at the bottom. And so they didn't bother. They could have, if you think about it, the tooling for the adapter was probably more than enough to make an actual cartridge case. But the defiance to be like, no, we're going to make a real Intellivision cartridge and make it look and be evocative of Intellivision, even though they're using it on the 2600, I thought was a really interesting approach for them.
When I heard they were coming out with Atari games, I was in the camp that, they know that that's the market leader. We might as well jump on the bandwagon. And there were so many. There must have been at least 2-3 dozen companies at that time producing games for the 2600. So what's another one?
The sports games were fantastic from M Network, and I remember really liking Star Strike on the Intellivision because it felt like the sequence from Star Wars were going to the trench, and that was coming to the 2600. So secretly I was super excited that I was going to start getting these Intellivision games on the Atari 2600.
The hyped Mattel games like Astro Smash, which became Astro Blast, I like that game. And I think it was better to play on the Atari with the joystick than it was to play on the Intellivision with the disc.
One game I played a lot of, probably more than any others, and it's a weird outlier, is Frogs and Flies, which is a port of Frog Bog. Dark Cavern, a good version of Night Stalker, which should have been my favorite. It's one of my favorites, but it was Frogs and Flies. I played a hell of a lot of Frogs and Flies.
They run the gamut as far as being good and bad. But a lot of them are based on Intellivision titles that didn't already exist on the 2600. So I think it's great that they did that.
They pushed the limits of the Atari 2600. So games like Bump and Jump or Air Raiders or even like their football and baseball games, they were pretty impressive games. They looked really close to their Intellivision counterparts, but also had their own unique look, and they had no compromises. So for a company to kind of come in and just try to cash in on the Atari craze, that isn't what it felt like. It actually felt like they were coming in here to make a difference and make really good, solid Atari 2600 games.
So I like to think that we raised the bar. And then maybe others came along and did way better, who knows? But we cracked it. We said, hey, you don't have to do the old hat stuff. You can play with it like it's an instrument. You can pluck the strings different ways.
It's been noted over the years that when there are at least 2 and sometimes 3 consoles fighting it out is when the video game business is its healthiest.
I think there were only some of the business people for whom it was war. And even though I'm the one who started saying cartridge wars, that was a turn of phrase as a metaphor as opposed to and let's draw blood. But inside the toy industry, they really did think that way. Maybe it was mid-November of '82. And so we do a demo. But the VP of marketing, his fancy suit, sitting there. The VP turns his head very slowly and he looks at me and he goes, "What you have to understand, young man, is that we are at war. We are at war with ATARI," which tells you the attitudes of Mattel. "Every sale that we make takes something away from ATARI and gives it to us. And even if I can't sell it now, I can stop somebody from buying an ATARI now with this game. And that's why we're putting it on television. And you have to understand that this is a war." I don't know if I can get my eyelids as low as his, but so we got the speech.
To Atari, it was a console war. To Mattel's Intellivision, it was a console war. To Activision, it was an opportunity.
And as kids, we didn't care at all. You know, I would go over to friends' houses to play ColecoVision, and I was amazed. You know, like Donkey Kong was amazing. The controller sucked, but the games were still a blast to play, and we just ignored that. And same thing with Intellivision. Tons of fun games in Intellivision. The controller sucked, but we didn't care. We were having fun playing the games.
It's just ironic that there's much less of a console war now, because, I mean, how many different consoles can you play Call of Duty on? All of them? Right. So it doesn't even work that way anymore. But if you wanted to play a particular game, if you wanted to play Plimpton's Baseball or whatever they called it, you had to have the Intellivision. There was no other way. And that certainly did make it a battle.
If you go back and you look at the old Intellivision and Atari commercials and how they duel in different ways and sometimes make fun of each other and so on, you see the height of it as far as the public was concerned.
It was definitely a console war between the 2 console makers, but we could use any console we wanted, and in fact would occasionally do that. We would say this game would work so much better on the Intellivision, let's put it over on the Intellivision shelf and work on it when we can. So yes, there was a console war, but there were those of us who benefited from it.
I mean, Atari was so far ahead in sales, I don't think they really worried about Intel. Maybe at first they did, but they were outselling it.
Yes, it was a war, but I think that the money was so heavily on the Atari side that, you know, Mattel was fighting a losing battle out the door.
Atari sold about 27.5 million VCSs. That's between 1977 and 1991. I don't know if that's if the numbers for the Intellivision are from just Mattel Electronics, but their total run was about 3 million.
Well, you know, they say that history goes to the victors. As the guy who coined the term console war, I would say actually that Atari won the first console war, because as much as I hate to say it, we never caught Atari in sales. We never sold as many games, we never sold as many consoles. Making money in this business is something that you have to do in order to keep making games. We're driven by passion, we have a love of making games. In the end, console wars are the business part of it. We as game makers never felt like we were at war. We're just trying to build great games that will sell.